This is the example paragraph from week 4 lecture notes describing a statistical experiment on Whittier College student commute times. The goal is to switch to passive voice, and we're going to have several concepts: the subject of the sentence, the verb of the sentence, and then the object of the sentence. And sentences can be complex or very simple. So obviously, for longer sentences, there could be multiple subjects, verbs, and objects. So let's pay attention to breaking down sentences into their components and rearranging them to the passive voice. Notice this paragraph is written mostly with the first person plural. We measured, we organized the data, etc. So secondly, there's a topical sentence. We measure the average commute time. That's the telling you the topic or the theme of the paragraph, and then what follows is a list: first, second, and third. Three major stages of the experiment. So you can tell this paragraph has come from an outline where there's the main branch, the second main branch, the third main branch, and each of those branches has sub-branches. So this is a properly organized paragraph, written actively, and so the last thing to do to modify it so that it sounds very scientific and technical is to take the subject out of it. Why do we do that? Because scientifically it should not matter who performed the experiment. The experiment should be repeatable, but also, more importantly, it should be objective. It does not matter that we found the data. It simply matters that the data was found. And so it sounds more technical and impersonal that way, and that's a good thing. So we're going to put our resulting paragraph down in the bottom. We're going to copy sentences into this area above subject, verb, object. So let's take our first sentence. We measured the average commute time of a typical Whittier College student via the following procedure. So the subject is we, the verb is measured, and the object is the average commute time. And then there's more words that I'll put in parentheses, and we'll just say the parenthetical rest of the sentence will be of a typical Whittier College student via the following procedure. So what that's doing is it's adding clarifying information. If you wrote simply we measured the average commute time and did not include the parenthetical rest of the sentence, that would be technically a grammatically correct full sentence, but it would not be providing the necessary details to the reader. So what we're going to do in switching to passive voice is we're going to put the object first. So the object will go, then the verb will go, and then the parenthetical rest of the sentence will go. So if we want to place the object first, the object is the average commute time, and the verb then will be measured, and then the parenthetical rest of the sentence will go of a typical Whittier College student via the following procedure. Let's think about this though. The average commute time measured of a typical Whittier College student via the following procedure. First of all, what's the verb? So the verb needs to be properly conjugated into passive voice, and in this case it's past tense. So the commute time was measured, the average commute time was measured, and then now we can think about this parenthetical, sentence as parenthetical rest of the sentence as something we can, break apart and put in the sentence as it's appropriate. So now that the sentence is in passive voice, technically we need to make sure it's clean. We need to clean it up a little bit. The average commute time of whom? Of what? So of a Whittier College student. Let's take that part of the parenthetical rest of the sentence and put it where it belongs. So I think it belongs after this new subject, which is really the former object. So the average commute time of a typical Whittier College student was measured, period. That would be a complete sentence. But we add the additional phrase via the following procedure. Measured and via go together. Measured and via, that's a verb. It's like you can run, you can drive via the highway, you can travel via plane. There's via is a word that attaches to a verb somehow, so it really needs to be next to the verb or near the verb to make sense. So the average commute time of Whittier College student was measured via the following procedure. Let's go to the next sentence. But first, let's think about this time flow word or flow control word there. First is a word that indicates we're about to begin a list of procedures, and it's going to organize the temporal or chronological perspective for the reader. So you're saying, listen, reader, that there's going to be this first procedure that has to be done before the rest of them, and that first portion is to actually get the names or the email addresses of the students. That's done via the registrar. So the sentence is, we obtained a full roster of students through the registrar. The subject is we. The verb in this case is obtained. And then the object is a full roster of students. And then the parenthetical rest of the sentence would be adding clarifying information through the registrar. So what we need to do is make our sentence follow the passive form, so object, verb, and then the parenthetical rest of the sentence. So the object would be a full roster of students, and then the verb would be obtained. And then we have, so that now that's object verb. So the passive form, a full roster of students obtained, and we probably need to conjugate that into the past tense correctly. So a full roster of students was obtained through the registrar. So the parenthetical rest of the sentence can remain where it is, through the registrar. The average commute time of a typical Whittier College student was measured via the following procedure. First, a full roster of students was obtained through the registrar. So we're doing good so far, doing well. That's the first procedure has been placed into the final resulting paragraph that's in passive voice. Let's go to the next sentence, second. So we've completed the first procedure. Now comes the second main procedure. And the sentence that follows is, we created a generic email form and we asked the students to write down their commute times for 10 consecutive school days and report the average. That's a longer sentence. It has several pieces, so we're going to break that down into subcomponents. Let's look at the first subcomponent. We created a generic email form. That would be on its own a complete sentence. And so the verb is created in the past tense, we created. And then the object is a generic email form. There is no parenthetical rest of the sentence if we're just considering what comes before the paragraph, or not the paragraph, the comma. So let's place this into object, verb, and then the rest of the sentence. So the object would come first. A generic email form was created. So in the passive voice, in the past tense, the object now comes first, a generic email form, and then was created, the verb. Now the rest of the sentence follows, but there is no rest of the sentence in this first part that's now in italics before the comma. So that's complete. What if we just stick with the comma and construction? So we're just stapling two sentences together, comma, and we ask the students to write down their commute times. So um, so there's the uh, subject we asked is the verb, asked is the verb, and then the students uh, is the object. And there is now a parenthetical rest of the sentence. What do we ask them to do? We ask them to write down their um, commute times for 10, you know, let's leave it like that so far. And so what we need to do is now we're working on our passive voice sentence here, and we're just following the comma and. Uh, how about we say the object first, the students, the verb next, were asked. So we have to conjugate the verb asked into passive voice. So and the students were asked. Um, and then the parenthetical rest of the sentence to write down their commute times for 10 consecutive days and to report the average. The to in front of report is important because it follows like to write. Um, if you were asked to write, you would also be asked to report. You would never ask someone write. Like the students were asked write down their commute times. The students were asked report the average. You need the to there because that puts the verb into the infinitive. It's the second verb in the sentence, so the only one verb can be conjugated per sentence. So you would never say, um, you know, I'm trying to think of an example. I am going to ask uh, you a question. You would never put that second. You would never conjugate that second verb. You would never say, "I am going to ask a question." I'm going to ask you a question. That doesn't make any sense. There's only one verb that goes with the subject. Um, or in this case, since we're doing passive voice, the object comes first. The object becomes like the subject in passive voice. A generic email form was created, and the students were asked to write down their commute times for 10 consecutive days and to report the average. You might consider saying the average time. So there's one more thing that we might modify with this sentence since while we're here, a generic email form was created and the students were asked. So technically the sentence is about two things. The first part, a generic email form was created, that's about the email form. The second part, and the students were asked to write down, that's about the students. And we want the sentence to be about one idea the whole time. And so we need to look at, instead of simply stapling together two unrelated sentences with a comma and, we have other choices. So for example, we can say in which the students were asked to write down. So that flows better. That makes the sentence about the email form the whole time. Because you're saying in which the students, so in what? The email form. So this email form contains questions that ask the students things, including about commute times. So in which is one example. You could also break it into two sentences. So a generic email form was created in the form, or maybe it's more appropriate to say on the form the students were asked to write down. So that second sentence is about the form still, but it's a whole other sentence, and the first sentence is rather short. It's only 6 words. A generic email form was created. So I like in which better because it does the job in all one sentence. Even though that sentence is on the long side, it's still about one thing the whole time. It's passive, it's technical, etc. Um, so this sentence is technically uh, in the second phase of the paragraph, so it should go there in the final result. A generic email form was created. However, look at the next sentence after the sentence we've just modified. Um, the sentence we're on is still under the second phase of the paragraph, so we haven't yet passed this place in the paragraph where it says third. So we're still talking about the form or something else that the form does. So what we want to do is look at this active sentence. The form requires the student to report the type of transportation they used to travel to campus. The subject is the form, and then the verb is requires. And it says the student, I think what we really mean is the students to report the type of transportation they used to travel to campus. So the parenthetical rest of the sentence that we'll have to sprinkle throughout the result would be to report. Well, actually, yeah, it's right here. To report the type of transportation they used to travel to campus. So the form requires the students to report. That would be a complete sentence, but there's additional clarifying information parenthetically or in the parenthetical rest of the sentence. So we need to now generate the passive form of this next sentence. So we want to place the object first. So the students, the verb is requires. So I think that's conjugated in the in the actual present tense. The form requires. It's okay that it's in the present tense. The form could still exist. It's not like the form's been destroyed. It might have been more appropriate to say the form required in the past tense the students to do something. But it's no matter because we're putting in the passive voice anyway. So the students are required. So the verb is requires or to require, but we want to put that in the passive form. So in the past tense, but also, well, actually, the way I've written it is are required, parenthetically. So this is interesting. Should it be in present or past tense? Well, technically, at the moment, the students are required to report the type of transportation they use to travel to campus. That's actually in the present tense. It's in passive form, but it's in the present tense. So the students were required would be in the past tense. The students were required to report the type of transportation they use to travel to campus. That's, a done deal. That's a finished task. They were required to do it. They did it. Now it's over. So to stay consistent, I think we should keep the same tense throughout the paragraph, at least paragraph wide, if not the entire report. I think you always want to keep the same tense, unless there's an exception to the rule. So the students were required to report the type of transportation they used to get to campus. So let's put that here, and then clean up the formatting a little bit. The students were required to report the type of transportation they used to travel to campus. So we might need to modify this one more time as we stick it into the final result. So let's stick it here. We're technically still in the second stage of the logical flow or the temporal flow or the chronological order of the experimental procedures. So let's read the last part of the prior sentence. And to report the average time period, the students were required to report the type of transportation they used to travel to campus. So that's a detail that's in the proper chronological order. It's less important than getting the average time data. It's still important though. It modifies the results. If you know that someone's on a bicycle versus a car or a bus, then you would be able to better interpret the results. But so it's that sentence is where it should be, but it doesn't really flow. It's kind of like there's a stop and then a start again. So read it from second all the way to the end. Second, a generic email form was created in which the students were asked to write down their commute times for 10 consecutive days and to report the average time. The students were required to report the type of transportation they used to travel to campus. Well, so there's technically two things they're reporting. So it might be worthwhile so that the reader doesn't get confused about what's being reported or what's more important. You might want to say something like, in addition, the students were required to report the type of transportation they used. You could also say additionally, the students were required to report. Um, I think that those are nice. Those are kind of fancier ways of joining the two sentences under the second, like, general procedure, um, because there's, the first sentence is about the generic email form and the average time, but it needs to be joined to this latest sentence. The students were required to report the type of transportation. But what if there was a way to modify the second sentence so it just flowed without having to stick in like too many extra words? The students were required um, also to report the type of transportation. You could stick also in one of two places. You could stick it after the infinitive. The students were required to report also the type of transportation. I think it doesn't sound as good there to me. I could be wrong whether that's technically correct or not. But the students were required also to report the type of transportation they used to travel to campus. So you could say in addition or additionally or further. Sometimes you can, like, don't say farther. That refers to a distance. But further, the students were required. But further sounds like it's extra, or it's icing, or maybe we went further, we pushed the envelope further, but it's not, uh, uh, it doesn't say exactly what I think the experimenter means here. What the experimenter means here is that we need this information also. And so also seems to be the simplest way to do it. Okay, back to passive voice. We've now reached the third stage of the logical flow, or the chronological flow of the paragraph. So third, what is the current sentence then? We organized the data into a histogram, and the average commute was 42 minutes. So let's take this sentence in active form and get it into passive form. So the subject is back to the consistent we, and then the verb is organized. And then the object is technically the data. So if you said we organize the data, period, that would be a full sentence, but it would not convey enough information. So the rest of the information, or the parenthetical rest of the sentence, would be into a histogram. And then let's leave the rest of the sentence, for next time, or for the next passive voice conversion. So what we want to do is get the object first, then the verb, then the parenthetical rest of the sentence. So let's put the object first, the data, and then we need, with the data organized, how about the data was organized into a histogram. So you could say that, full stop, the data was organized into a histogram, period. Um, that almost conveys the information. If you know what a histogram is, the middle of the histogram is the average. So technically it's the median, but then you can compute the average from the histogram very, very simply. So the data was organized into a histogram, comma, and here's a trick though. Look at the tense of what follows. The average commute time was 42 minutes. There's no we remaining in the sentence. There's no reference to who did the measurement. In fact, we're just making a comment about the data, the average commute time. So the whole point of making, scientific writing or technical writing into passive voice is that it removes the researcher or the investigator from the picture and focuses on the results, placing them front and center. It should not matter who does the experiment. The experiment should be repeatable anyway. And further, it should be objective. It should not matter who does it. So this second sentence follows that, even though it's not really in passive voice. It's just in simple past tense. The average commute time, here we come to the verb, was 42 minutes. So the time was 42 minutes. That's in past tense. So the data was organized into a histogram, and the average commute time was 42 minutes. So let's put that in the bank. The data was organized into a histogram, and the average commute time was 42 minutes. So that's almost what I want it to say. That it might not be obvious though to every reader how the average time is extracted from the histogram of times. So you might say something like, um, and from the histogram, the average commute time was 42 minutes. So you could say that. Yeah, you might not even make you could be more general and not even talk about histograms at all. That's probably a better idea for a general audience here. So you could just say something like the data was analyzed and the average commute time was 42 minutes. So you could say something like that, or for a more technical audience, you could make mention of the data organized into histogram, and from the histogram, the average commute time was 42 minutes. You might also you could be a lot fancier here, though. You could say from the histogram, or how about just from a histogram, the average commute time was found to be 42 minutes. So you could say something like that, like from a histogram, or from a histogram of the data. So there's lots of ways of going about putting things into passive voice. I recommend keeping it simple until you feel or have an intuition for what is passive versus what is active. Third, the data was organized into a histogram, and from the histogram, the average commute time uh, was 42 minutes. Finally, we have one more sentence to go. We found that the variation about the mean was 15 minutes. So this is our final result from the analysis. We found the variation about the mean was 15 minutes. The subject is we, the verb is found, and then you might put the word that. We found that. So that is necessary to stick with the verb, because if you're about to make a comment about what was found. So we found that the data, in this case the variation, we found that the variation about the mean was 15 minutes. If we really want to modify the sentence so that we fit the strict subject verb object pattern, and we wanted to get rid of the that, we could say we found the variation about the mean to be 15 minutes. And so that way, this about the mean to be 15 minutes could be the parenthetical rest of the sentence. And so the variation about the mean to be 15 minutes. So we found the variation period. That would be a full grammatically correct sentence. So how about we put it into passive form and call it a day. So the variation of let's see. So we need the object first, and then we need the verb. The variation was found, and then the parenthetical rest of the sentence about the mean to be 15 minutes. However, that doesn't make any sense. The variation was found about the mean to be 15 minutes. So I think this parenthetical rest of the sentence, part of it, the variation of what? Well, about the mean, the variation about the mean was found to be 15 minutes. So that's a very nice passive voice sentence. We had to modify the parenthetical part of it to go nearer to the former subject now, or former object, now the subject. just so that it makes sense, the variation about the mean. If you separate about the mean from variation, it starts to make less sense because they don't know what's varying. So now we finally arrive at our result. So I'm going to delete the matter in between here and just focus on the comparison of these two paragraphs. So let's read the full version of the result that's been now placed into passive voice. The average commute time of a typical Whittier College student was measured via the following procedure. First, a full roster of students was obtained through the registrar. Second, a generic email form was created in which the students were asked to write down their commute times for 10 consecutive days and to report the average time. The students were required also to report the type of transportation they used to travel to campus. Third, the data was organized into a histogram, and from the histogram the average commute time was 42 minutes. The variation about the mean was found to be 15 minutes. So that's a nice, passive, technical, impersonal statement about the results. It does not talk about how we measured the average commute time. It doesn't talk about us obtaining how we obtained the full roster. In other words, the reader is not switching between us and the results or who and the what, but it's just about the what, the things, the data, the entire time. And so that is why we write that way, and I've given you an example here of how to convert a paragraph written actively with plenty of subjects in the first person plural, in this case, to a passive impersonal statement about the data.